Final Fantasy V is one of the wackiest JRPGs I have ever played. When I played Dragon Quest XI for its world review, I found myself relegating every party member to one specific action. Serena for healing, Sylvando for status effects, Jade for basic attacks. It's a problem that I've had with a lot of JRPGs. At around the midpoint of the game, I figured out the predominant strategy for every member of the party and simply have them follow the pattern that helps me win every enemy encounter. That's when most JRPGs get boring for me, once all the planning and optimizing are done, and from then on I simply check every store for better gear and move on. Final Fantasy V, for almost the entire game, was hitting that sweet experimental phase for me, all thanks to the job system. The ability to mix up and match my classes led me to endless min-maxing. Should I create my character who deals solely in magic? Should I try to find what the best physical attack best goes with this ability? I was arguably having more fun in the menus than the battles. I ended up creating experimental powerhouse classes you would never see if a developer came up with them. A samurai with a skill for summoning, a ninja that could turn the very ground against you, a mystic knight with an aptitude for holy healing, a berserker who secretly learns the attacks of his foes, then unleashes them as a blue mage. This quirky, hilariously broken system was where I got most of my enjoyment out of Final Fantasy V, and it was so refreshing to have a JRPG to do something wildly different than everything else I've played. Well, that's not true. I played Yakuza Like a Dragon, and that game had a job system, but I didn't understand what it was trying to tell me at the time, so I ended up ignoring it. Which is probably the reason I couldn't beat Mirrorface. The customization completely removed the criticism I thought I was going to have when I discovered there were only 4 playable characters. I thought it would become boring without the option to swap to different characters with different playstyles, but the game was already way ahead of me, and the smaller cast does let the game have a more character-focused story, but I think the story is squandered in this game, although I'm not here to talk about that. Almost every job was simple to understand and fun to optimize into my strategies, except for the chemist. I know now that the chemist is one of the most broken classes in the game, but when I played as them, the game asked me to mix items together, and I found it too confusing. Like, it wanted me to learn an entire second language just to play as one class, so I ended up dropping it. Which in hindsight, I really regret doing because I definitely needed more black magic against Leviathan. Still, I think that the class could have had a bit of tuning to make it more understandable, although this game was called Final Fantasy Extreme, so maybe Square Enix wanted it that way. The battles themselves are frenetic and fast-paced, which is precisely the opposite of how I would generally describe a turn-based RPG. This is because of the ATB system. This system removes the calm tactician feeling present in a game like Dragon Quest, and replaces it with nail-biting tension and being able to adapt your strategy on the fly. I have to admit that the further I got into the game and the more options I had for my wacky character builds, it forced me to pause time during the spells, as I was getting bewildered by my choices. For the first few dungeons of the game though, I loved this lurched tone shift in my battles. I never thought it was possible to capture spur-of-the-moment decision-making in a turn-based game without doing something cheap like adding an arbitrary timer to your moves. Now, I've alluded to the late game a couple of times now, and I think it's a good time to talk about it. The late game grind was utterly painful. What were once simple mobs to be disposed of became beefy tanks that took several minutes to take down. It's at this point where the game became a chore for me, and it was so mentally draining having to spam cure after every battle. Not to say that it's hard, aside from some of the bosses, but should the regular enemies really have above 3,000 health? What's worse is that I feel like the game was telling me to stop experimenting, which was a horrible realization to come to. So I looked at my party, built an optimized team, and I spent the last third of the game without switching jobs. It felt like the game was telling me I'd had my fun, and now it was time to get serious. I felt really disappointed. But, and I'm definitely reading too much into it here, this late game difficulty spike happens around the time that the plot starts entering its final act, so from a narrative standpoint, I can appreciate how the game ramps up alongside the story. Still, I think the game overall suffers from it. I want to highlight the bosses of Final Fantasy V. While some of them are just gimmicked fights that drag on, most of them are epic tests of endurance that require experimentation and pre-planning. The bosses work similarly to how I've heard Elden Ring being described, although I've never played Elden Ring, and I don't really plan to. Oftentimes, I'll walk up to the boss with my robust gear equipped, get my ass handed to me, declare it impossible, and then try new, unconventional methods of attack. The fight I want to especially shout out is the first X-Death battle. This imperial figure towers over your party, a tenebrific aura enshrouding his regal, gold-tipped armor. The size of his pixel art imposes upon you as a malicious power emanates from his immaculate sprite work. You almost forget that he has one of the stupidest names I've ever heard for a villain. With his gargantuan health pool and calamitous moveset, he provides such an epic battle for what I assumed was the final fight. Maybe it should have been, because this fight is the high point of the game. Although Bahamut was also a spectacular fight that nostalgically called back to the start of the game, but this time you fight a far more grandiose foe, the King of Skies himself. Final Fantasy V has the most absurd gameplay I've ever seen in a JRPG, with wacky experimental combinations that can help the player create indestructible elder gods or unplayable incompetents. In addition, it allows players to write their own stories. For example, did you fell Gilgamesh with a Fire-Raga-infused Great Blade? Or did you cheese him by spamming Xenniage until he drowned in a sea of money? While the third act introduces very grindy, random enemy encounters, I mean, seriously, those hanging skeletons have over 6,000 hit points and spawn with multiple enemies. Still, Final Fantasy V is one of the most inventive, creative, and replayable JRPGs I've ever played.